What if the perfect wedding was all a lie? Imagine a billion-dollar heiress, a fairy tale ceremony, and a groom with a devastating secret. In today's story, we're taking you inside the most anticipated society wedding of the year, where the vows take a shocking turn. Just when the bride is supposed to say, "I do," she exposes her groom's affair in front of 300 horrified guests. The Mistress. She's sitting in the front row. Get ready for a story of love lies and the ultimate public revenge that had everyone talking from Newport to New York. The world knew Isabella de la Cruz as the sole heiress to the Cruz Hotel empire, a portfolio of luxury properties that glittered across the globe like a string of priceless diamonds. Her life as curated for the pages of Vogue and Tatler was a seamless montage of charity galas in Geneva art auctions in Hong Kong and polo matches in the English countryside. She was the girl who had everything, and on a perfect sun-drenched Saturday in late August, she was supposed to get the one thing money couldn't buy: a soulmate. Her chosen one was Julian Croft, a man whose pedigree was as polished as his Oxford brogues. Julian came from old money, the kind that whispered through the hallowed halls of Ivy League universities and summered in sprawling cedar-shingled estates in the Hamptons. He was a rising star in the world of private equity, his ambition a perfect, razor-sharp complement to Isabella's inherited grace. To the outside world, they were a dynasty in the making, a merger of New World glamour and Old World prestige. Their wedding was billed as the social event of the decade. The venue was Isabella's family estate in Newport, Rhode Island, a magnificent Gilded Age mansion named Serafina, perched dramatically on the cliffs overlooking the Atlantic. Its limestone facade, inspired by the grand chateaux of the Loire Valley, seemed to rise from the sea mist itself. For the wedding, its sprawling lawns had been transformed into an ethereal wonderland. A custom-built glass conservatory shimmering under the afternoon sun was filled with 10,000 white orchids, their petals as delicate and pristine as the bride's couture gown. The air was thick with the scent of flowers and the salty tang of the ocean, a heady perfume of wealth and expectation. Inside the mansion's bridal suite, a room the size of a small apartment, Isabella sat before a Louis XVI vanity, a vision in ivory silk and lace. The dress, a bespoke creation by a famed Parisian designer, had taken over 800 hours to bead by hand. A team of stylists, makeup artists, and assistants fluttered around her like anxious butterflies. Her mother, Elena de la Cruz, a woman whose beauty had been preserved by a regimen of Swiss dermatologists and fierce self-control, stood by the window, her gaze fixed on the arriving guests. "The Vanderbilts are here," Elena announced, her voice as crisp as a freshly printed stock certificate. "And I see Senator Thompson's car. Julian has certainly invited a powerful circle." Isabella offered a faint smile in the mirror's reflection. "He's good at that." There was a subtle, almost imperceptible coolness in her tone, a note of discord in the symphony of perfection. For the past few months, a shadow had been creeping at the edges of her idyllic life, a tiny hairline crack in the flawless facade of her relationship. It had started with small things easily dismissed at first. Julian, who had once been an open book, had become more guarded with his phone, angling it away from her when he texted. He'd begun working later, his evenings consumed by urgent client dinners that left him smelling faintly of a perfume that wasn't hers. Then there were the hushed phone calls, the ones he would take in another room, his voice a low, urgent murmur. When she'd ask who it was, he'd wave a dismissive hand. "Just work, darling. You know how it is. A deal is about to close." She had tried to believe him. She wanted to believe him. Their life together was a meticulously planned masterpiece, every detail arranged and agreed upon. They had picked out the blueprints for their future home in Greenwich, debated the names of their future children, Leo for a boy, Serafina for a girl after the estate, and planned a 6-week honeymoon sailing through the Greek Isles. To doubt Julian was to doubt the very foundation of the future she had so carefully constructed. But the doubts lingered, persistent and unwelcome, like a phantom ache. A week before the wedding, she'd found a receipt in his suit pocket, a charge from a discreet boutique hotel in Soho for a Tuesday afternoon. He was supposed to have been in a board meeting all day. When she confronted him, he'd laughed it off, his charm as smooth and intoxicating as the vintage scotch he favored. A colleague from London flew in unexpectedly, he'd explained, pulling her into his arms. "We needed a quiet place to strategize before the meeting. You're being paranoid, my love. Is it pre-wedding jitters?" He kissed her forehead, his touch meant to soothe, but it felt like a dismissal. The incident that truly broke her trust, however, happened just 3 days ago. She had been looking for a document in his home office when she stumbled upon a small velvet jewelry box tucked away in the back of his desk drawer. It wasn't the box for her engagement ring. This one was unfamiliar. Her heart hammering against her ribs, she opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of black satin, was a delicate gold locket. It was beautiful, but it wasn't for her. Engraved on the back were the initials S.J., S.J. The letters burned into her memory. They felt alien, a secret language she wasn't meant to understand. Who was S.J.? Why was Julian buying her lockets? The questions swirled in her mind, a venomous vortex of suspicion and fear. She had placed the box back in the drawer, her hands trembling, and closed it softly. She didn't confront him. Not yet. Confrontation would bring denial, more lies, more gaslighting. She needed proof. She needed the truth, no matter how ugly. Her best friend and maid of honor, a sharp-witted art gallery owner named Chloe, had sensed her unease for weeks. "You haven't seemed yourself," Chloe had said over lunch a few days prior, her eyes full of concern. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. This should be the happiest time of your life." Isabella had wanted to confide in her to unload the burden of her suspicions, but she couldn't. Admitting her fears out loud would make them real, and she wasn't ready for that. So she had smiled and blamed it on the stress of the wedding planning. Now, sitting in her bridal suite, the sounds of the string quartet drifting up from the lawn, Isabella felt a cold, hard knot of certainty forming in her stomach. The gilded cage she had lived in her entire life had never felt more suffocating. The 10,000 orchids suddenly seemed funereal, the magnificent view of the ocean a vast, indifferent expanse. Today was not about love or soulmates. It was about a performance. And as she looked at her reflection, the perfect bride, the perfect heiress, the perfect fool, she knew with a chilling sense of clarity that the script for today's performance was about to be rewritten entirely. The curtain was about to rise on a drama far more real than anyone could have ever imagined. The decision to investigate Julian herself was not made in a single dramatic moment of clarity. It was a slow, creeping dawn of realization born out of sleepless nights, and the hollow echo of his increasingly transparent excuses. The discovery of the locket was the tipping point. The initials S.J. were a loose thread, and Isabella, with the same meticulous precision she applied to managing her family's charitable foundation, began to pull. Her first move was to betray her own principles. Using a software she had once condemned as an invasion of privacy, she installed a tracker on Julian's phone. The guilt was a bitter pill, but the gnawing need to know the truth was a far more powerful force. She told herself it was a necessary evil, a diagnostic tool to either confirm her fears and end the charade, or to allay them and allow her to walk down the aisle with a clear heart. The first few days yielded nothing but confirmation of his stated schedule, his office on Park Avenue, a business lunch at the Grill, his private gym. Isabella began to feel a flicker of hope, a desperate wish that she had been wrong, that his explanation for the hotel and the locket, however flimsy, was true. Perhaps S.J. was a client, a relative, an innocent acquaintance. The illusion shattered on the Tuesday before the wedding. Julian had told her he was flying to Chicago for a one-day whirlwind series of meetings with a potential investor. He had kissed her goodbye at dawn, his travel bag in hand, promising to call her the moment he landed. Isabella had watched his car disappear down the long gravel driveway of the estate, her heart a tangled mess of love and suspicion. At 10:00 a.m., her laptop pinged. The tracker showed Julian's phone was not at JFK Airport. It wasn't even heading towards an airport. It was moving steadily up Manhattan's west side, coming to a stop at an address in the Upper West Side. A pre-war brownstone on a quiet, tree-lined street. It was nowhere near his office or any known business associate's location. Isabella's breath hitched. Her hands felt cold and clammy as she typed the address into a search engine. The building was a residential co-op, elegant and discreet. She scanned the list of publicly registered residents, her eyes flying down the names. And then she saw it. Apartment 4B, Sarah Jenkins, S.J. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The air in the room grew thin and a low ringing started in her ears. Sarah Jenkins. The name meant nothing to her, yet in that moment it felt like the most significant name in the world. It was the name of the woman who owned the other half of Julian's life. The name of the woman for whom he bought secret lockets. For a long moment, Isabella just stared at the screen, the two initials glowing like embers. The betrayal was no longer a shadowy fear. It had a name and an address. He wasn't in Chicago. He was with her. Now. While their wedding invitations sat on the mantles of the most powerful people in the country. A cold, terrifying calm washed over her. The hurt was a deep physical ache in her chest, but it was accompanied by a surge of adrenaline, a chilling new sense of purpose. Her fairy tale was a sham, a house of cards built on a foundation of lies. And if it was all going to come crashing down, she decided she wouldn't be the only one buried in the rubble. Her next call was to a man her father had used for years for sensitive corporate matters, a euphemism for the kind of high-stakes private investigation that never saw the light of day. His name was Mr. Harrison, a former FBI agent with a network of contacts that reached into the darkest corners of the city. "Isabella," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "To what do I owe the pleasure? I trust your father is well." "He is," Isabella replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "But this call isn't about him. I need your services, Mr. Harrison. It's a personal matter, and it requires the utmost discretion." She didn't have to explain the stakes. He understood immediately. Within the hour, he had a team in place. He didn't ask for a reason. He only asked for a name and a photograph. Isabella sent him Julian's official engagement portrait and the name Sarah Jenkins. The information started flowing in that afternoon, delivered in encrypted files to a secure email address. The report was concise, clinical, and utterly devastating. Sarah Jenkins was 29 years old, a senior marketing manager at a rival private equity firm. She was ambitious, beautiful in a sharp corporate way, and according to Harrison's surveillance had been seeing Julian Croft for the past 11 months. 11 months. The timeline was a punch to the gut. He had started seeing her just a month after he proposed to Isabella. He had been with this woman while they were tasting wedding cakes, while they were finalizing the guest list, while he was looking into Isabella's eyes and telling her he couldn't wait to spend the rest of his life with her. The report was filled with damning details. Photographs of Julian and Sarah leaving her apartment building in the early morning hours. Credit card statements that showed a pattern of lavish gifts, designer handbags, expensive dinners, weekend trips to a spa in the Berkshires that he had claimed were solo hiking trips to clear his head. The hotel receipt from Soho matched a day they were seen entering the establishment together hand in hand. The worst part was the locket. Harrison's team had managed to get a candid shot of Sarah Jenkins leaving a coffee shop 2 days ago. There, gleaming against the collar of her silk blouse, was the delicate gold locket. The proof was irrefutable. Every lie, every late night, every whispered phone call, it all clicked into place, forming a sickening mosaic of deceit. Isabella read the report in the solitude of her private study, the room where she and Julian had planned their future. With each page, the heartbreak began to crystallize into something else, something harder and colder. It was a slow-burning rage. The sheer audacity of his betrayal was staggering. He hadn't just cheated. He had orchestrated a parallel life, a long-term calculated deception, all while preparing to marry into one of the most powerful families in the country. He wasn't just unfaithful. He was a predator, a con artist cloaked in Savile Row suits and old money charm. He wasn't after her heart, He was after her name, her connections, her empire. The wedding wasn't a celebration of love. It was the final stage of a corporate takeover. That night, Julian returned from his trip to Chicago, full of stories about the meetings and the demanding investors. He brought her a small gift, a first edition of her favorite book, which he'd supposedly found in a quaint Chicago bookstore. The gesture, which once would have seemed thoughtful and romantic, now felt grotesque, a calculated move to maintain his cover. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her close. "I missed you," he murmured into her hair. It felt wrong being in a different city, even for a day, when we're so close to finally being husband and wife. Isabella didn't pull away. She leaned into his embrace, her body rigid, her mind a whirlwind of cold fury. She let him hold her, let him kiss her. She played her part. But as she looked at him, she no longer saw the man she thought she loved. She saw a stranger, a fraud, and in the chilling quiet of her own mind, a plan began to take shape. A plan for the wedding day. He wanted a performance. She would give him one. He wanted a public spectacle celebrating their union. She would give him a public spectacle of a different kind. The wedding wouldn't be the culmination of his scheme. It would be the stage for his downfall. And everyone he had worked so hard to impress would have a front row seat. With the evidence from Mr. Harrison's report laid bare, Isabella's world fractured. The grief was a physical weight, a crushing pressure in her chest that made it difficult to breathe. But beneath the layers of hurt, a core of cold, hard anger was forging itself into a weapon. She now had the what. What she needed next was the who, not just Sarah Jenkins' name, but her essence, her role in this elaborate deception. Isabella needed to understand the woman who had been a ghost in her life for nearly a year. Her investigation became an obsession, a secret mission conducted in the stolen hours of the night. While the rest of the estate slept, Isabella would be in her study, the glow of her laptop casting long shadows on the walls. She dove into the digital footprint of Sarah Jenkins, dissecting her life with the detached precision of a surgeon. Sarah's social media profiles were a carefully curated exhibition of modern ambition. There were photos of her running marathons, her face flushed with determination. Posts about industry panels she'd spoken on showcasing her professional prowess. Pictures with a tight-knit group of friends at trendy rooftop bars in Manhattan, glasses of rosé held high in a toast to their own success. On the surface, she was the epitome of a driven, successful New York woman. There was no trace of Julian anywhere. Their affair was clearly a creature of the shadows, thriving in the anonymity of burner phones and discreet hotels. Isabella felt a strange, bitter pang of something akin to recognition. She saw in Sarah a mirror of the ambition Julian possessed, the same relentless drive for success. Perhaps that's what he was truly drawn to. Not just her, but a version of himself he could see in her eyes. The digital trail, however, could only reveal so much. Isabella needed to see her to understand the physical presence of the woman who had stolen her future. An opportunity arose 2 days before the wedding on Thursday. Mr. Harrison's team reported that Sarah Jenkins had a regular 7:00 p.m. yoga class in Tribeca. That afternoon, Isabella told her mother she was heading into the city for a final dress fitting, an excuse that was both plausible and blessedly brief. She drove herself, taking her nondescript electric sedan instead of the chauffeured Bentley, and dressed down in a cashmere sweater, jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low over her face. She felt like an imposter in her own life. She parked across the street from the yoga studio, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She waited, and then at 6:52 p.m. she saw her. Sarah Jenkins was taller than she'd expected, with a lean, athletic build. She had a cascade of dark, glossy hair pulled back into a high ponytail and a sharp, intelligent face that was striking rather than conventionally pretty. She moved with a sense of purpose, her head held high, her gaze focused. As she passed under a streetlight, Isabella saw the gold locket resting in the hollow of her throat. It seemed to catch the light and mock her. Watching her, Isabella felt a wave of nausea. This was real. This was the woman Julian was rushing to from his client dinners. This was the woman he was texting when he angled his phone away. Seeing her in the flesh transformed her from a name on a page into a living, breathing betrayal. But Isabella didn't drive away. She stayed watching the entrance to the studio for the entire hour-long class. Her mind was racing, trying to piece together the final crucial elements of her plan. Exposing Julian was one thing, but to do it effectively, to make the impact absolute and undeniable, she needed to control the narrative completely. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place by accident. That evening back at the estate, she was walking past the guest wing when she heard voices coming from the study Julian was using as a temporary office. It was him on the phone. His voice was low and intimate, the same tone he used with her when he thought he was being romantic. I know it's hard," he was saying. "Just a few more days, I promise. Once this is done, we can be together properly. The way we've always talked about." A pause. Isabella pressed her ear against the heavy oak door, her blood running cold. "No, she doesn't suspect a thing?" Julian continued, a hint of arrogant confidence in his voice. "She's completely wrapped up in the fantasy of it all." Honestly, it's almost too easy. The cruelty of his words was like a physical blow. Too easy. He saw her as a naive fool, a pawn in his game. "I have to go," he said abruptly. "But I'll see you Saturday. Front row, just like we planned. I want you to be the first person I see when it's all over." Front row. The words echoed in the silent hallway. He had invited his mistress to their wedding. He was going to stand at the altar, look out at his bride and his lover, all in the same glance. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of it was breathtaking. He wasn't just having an affair. He was flaunting it, hiding it in plain sight, reveling in the thrill of his own deception. A terrifying, incandescent rage filled Isabella. The last vestiges of her heartbreak burned away, replaced by an ice-cold resolve. Her plan, which had been forming in the abstract, now solidified into a concrete strategy. It was no longer just about exposing him. It was about orchestrating a moment of public humiliation so profound, so devastating, that his reputation, his career, and his future would be shattered in a single irrevocable instant. She now knew everything she needed to know. She knew about Sarah Jenkins. She knew about the locket. She knew about the 11 months of lies. And now she knew the most damning detail of all: his mistress would be there, seated in the front row, waiting for him. Isabella backed away from the door silently, her movements fluid and ghost-like. She retreated to her own suite at the far end of the mansion. She sat down at her desk and pulled out a piece of her personal cream-colored stationery. She picked up a fountain pen, its nib scratching softly in the stillness of the room. She wasn't writing her wedding vows anymore. She was scripting her revenge. She thought about the words Julian had used on the phone. "She doesn't suspect a thing. It's almost too easy." And a grim, determined smile touched her lips. He was right. It had been far too easy for him. But she was about to make the ending incredibly, spectacularly hard. The morning of the wedding dawned with an almost cinematic perfection. A soft golden light spilled over the manicured lawns of Serafina, making the dew on the grass sparkle like scattered diamonds. The sky was a flawless, cloudless blue, and the Atlantic Ocean was a calm, deep sapphire. It was a day designed for fairy tales, a perfect backdrop for the lie that was about to unfold. In the bridal suite, the atmosphere was one of controlled chaos. The air buzzed with the hum of hair dryers and the soft pop of champagne corks. Her bridesmaids, a flock of beautiful, chattering women in pale blush silk, floated around the room, their excitement a stark contrast to the icy calm that had settled deep within Isabella. She played her part with an Oscar-worthy performance. She smiled when her mother tearfully placed a family heirloom, a diamond and sapphire tiara, in her upswept hair. She laughed at her bridesmaids' jokes. She sipped the glass of Cristal champagne offered to her, the bubbles fizzing on her tongue, a strange festive prelude to the destruction she was about to unleash. On the outside, she was the picture of bridal bliss. Her makeup was flawless, her eyes bright, her skin luminous. The bespoke gown with its intricate beading and sweeping train fit her as if it were spun from moonlight and magic. But beneath the silk and lace, her heart beat with a slow, steady, and resolute rhythm. It was the heart of a general on the morning of a decisive battle. Chloe, her maid of honor, was the only one who seemed to notice the change. While the others were caught up in the fantasy, Chloe's sharp eyes saw the subtle tells, the unwavering stillness of Isabella's hands, the focused intensity in her gaze, the almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw. Are you okay?" Chloe asked, her voice a low whisper as she helped Isabella with her pearl earrings. "You seem distant." Isabella met her friend's concerned gaze in the mirror. For a fleeting moment she wanted to tell her everything, to share the crushing weight of her secret. But she couldn't risk it. A plan this volatile required absolute secrecy. One wrong word, one sympathetic glance towards the groom could derail the entire enterprise. So she forced a reassuring smile. "I'm perfect," she said, her voice sounding surprisingly light. "Just taking it all in. It's a little overwhelming, that's all." Chloe didn't look convinced, but she let it go, attributing it to the immense pressure of the day. Downstairs, the guests had assembled in the glass conservatory. It was a veritable who's who of international society. Tech billionaires mingled with European aristocrats, media moguls chatted with political power players. They were all there to witness the union of two great families, to be a part of the story. They had no idea they were about to become audience members to a tragedy. Julian stood at the altar, looking impossibly handsome in his custom Tom Ford tuxedo. He was the very image of a triumphant, adoring groom. He chatted amiably with the officiant, flashed a confident smile at his parents in the front row, and occasionally glanced at the entrance awaiting his bride. Isabella knew he was also scanning the front row for another face for Sarah Jenkins. Mr. Harrison had confirmed her attendance that morning with a single encrypted text, "Packages in position." Isabella had instructed him to have one of his operatives seated nearby, posing as a guest with a camera. She wanted every moment, every reaction captured for posterity. As the string quartet swelled, signaling the start of the procession, a hush fell over the conservatory. The bridesmaids began their slow, graceful walk down the aisle, their blush dresses a soft counterpoint to the sea of white orchids. Then it was Isabella's turn. As she stood at the entrance, her father on her arm, she took a deep breath. This was it. The point of no return. Her father, oblivious, squeezed her hand. "You look beautiful, my darling," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I am so proud of you." Isabella felt a pang of guilt for what she was about to do to him, to her family, to this day. But the thought of Julian's smug, confident face waiting for her at the altar burned away the guilt, leaving only cold, hard resolve. She began her walk down the aisle. The long path was lined with 1,000 flickering candles, their light reflecting in the glass walls of the conservatory. Every eye was on her. She could feel the collective gaze of 300 people, a physical pressure. She held her head high, her expression serene, a mask of perfect bridal composure. Her eyes met Julian's. He smiled, a wide, dazzling smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was a victor's smile, a conqueror's smile. He thought he had won. He saw her walking towards him, the ultimate prize, the key to the kingdom he so desperately craved. As she drew closer, her gaze swept over the front row. She saw her mother, her face a mask of proud composure. She saw Julian's parents beaming with delight. And then she saw her. Sarah Jenkins was seated between a hedge fund manager and his wife. She wore an elegant, understated navy blue dress, her dark hair styled in loose waves. She looked poised, confident, and proprietary. As Isabella's eyes met hers, Sarah offered a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of shared victory. The audacity of it sent a fresh surge of ice through Isabella's veins. Isabella reached the altar. Her father placed her hand in Julian's. Julian's grip was firm, his hand warm. "You look breathtaking," he murmured, his voice for her ears only. "Worth the wait." Isabella simply smiled. They turned to face the officiant, a kindly, silver-haired man who had known Isabella's family for years. He began the ceremony with warm, familiar words about love, partnership, and the sacred bond of marriage. Isabella listened to the words, but they felt like they were coming from a great distance. Her focus was entirely internal, her mind clear and sharp. She was running through the script she had written, memorizing her lines, preparing for her cue. The officiant turned to Julian. "Do you, Julian Croft, take Isabella de la Cruz to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Julian's voice was strong and clear as he recited his vows, his words full of promises of love, honor, and fidelity. He spoke of his undying devotion, of how Isabella had changed his life, of how he couldn't imagine a future without her. Each word was a lie, a polished stone laid on the path of his deceit. Isabella watched him, her expression unreadable. She saw Sarah Jenkins in the front row, a small, triumphant smile playing on her lips. Then it was Isabella's turn. The officiant smiled at her. "And do you, Isabella de la Cruz, take Julian Croft to be your lawfully wedded husband?" The entire conservatory held its breath. 300 pairs of eyes were fixed on her. This was the moment, the culmination of months of planning, of a lifetime of expectation. Isabella took a small step forward. She turned slightly, not just to face Julian, but to ensure the entire room could hear her. She took the microphone from the officiant, a move that was unexpected, but not yet alarming. She looked directly into Julian's eyes. His smile was still in place, but a flicker of confusion was dawning in their depths. "I can't," she said, her voice not a whisper, but a clear, resonant statement that carried to every corner of the glass conservatory. A collective, sharp intake of breath swept through the conservatory, a sound like the tide being sucked out to sea, leaving behind a sudden, unnerving void. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket of pure shock that smothered every other sound. The string quartet, poised to launch into a triumphant refrain, froze mid-motion, their bows hovering over their strings like statues. Every guest was utterly still, their champagne flutes halfway to their lips, their polite smiles frozen on their faces. Julian's own smile didn't just falter, it shattered. The confident, triumphant expression crumbled into a mask of utter bewilderment, his blue eyes wide with confusion. He took a half-step closer, his voice a raw, cracked whisper that barely carried in the charged air. "Izzy, what are you talking about? What's wrong?" Isabella ignored him. Her grip on the microphone was so tight her knuckles were sharp white peaks against her skin. She didn't look at him. Instead, her gaze swept across the assembled guests, a queen surveying her court. Her eyes, as cold and clear as chips of ice, scanned the sea of stunned, famous, and powerful faces, the titans of industry, the political brokers, the ancient aristocracy. Her gaze was methodical, deliberate, until it landed with the precision of a sniper on the front row. She was not a bride anymore. She was an executioner, and she was taking her time. "I can't marry Julian Croft," she announced, and this time her voice was not soft. It was imbued with a chilling strength, a resonant clarity that gained volume as it echoed slightly against the glass walls of the conservatory. "I cannot enter into a sacred vow with this man because the vows he just made, the beautiful, eloquent promises he just spoke, are a lie. Every single word." The finality of her declaration sent a fresh wave of shock through the room. Julian lurched toward her, his face paling to a ghastly, sallow white, a mask of panicked disbelief. "Isabella, stop it. Stop this right now," he hissed, reaching for her arm. "What is this? If this is some kind of sick pre-wedding jitters joke, it's not funny." Isabella pulled her arm away from his touch as if he were diseased. She finally turned her icy gaze back to him, and for the first time he saw not the adoring fiancée he had so easily manipulated, but a stranger, a woman of formidable, terrifying resolve. "Oh, this is no joke, Julian," she said, her voice dangerously soft. "This is a clarification, a public correction of the record. You see, I believe vows should be honest. And since yours were a work of fiction, I've taken the liberty of preparing some more accurate ones for you." With a slow, deliberate movement that held every single person in the room captive, she reached into the bodice of her couture gown, a secret pocket she had instructed the designer to add weeks ago. She pulled out a small folded piece of her personal cream-colored stationery, The room was so deathly quiet that the crisp sound of the paper unfolding seemed to crackle and pop like fire. She held the paper in one steady hand and the microphone in the other. She cleared her throat, her voice now devoid of any emotion but a chilling surgical precision. "Let's start again, shall we? From the top." She looked down at the paper, then up at Julian, whose entire body was trembling. "I, Julian Croft, take you Isabella de la Cruz." She began, her voice a cruel mimicry of the officiant's gentle tone. "Not as my beloved wife, but as my greatest acquisition, my crowning achievement in a lifetime of social climbing. I promise to leverage your family's name to secure my next round of funding. I promise to use your impeccable connections to climb to the top of a world that would otherwise never, ever have me." A wave of sharp staccato murmurs rippled through the crowd. The business leaders in attendance, men who understood the language of mergers and acquisitions better than the language of love, exchanged knowing, shocked glances. This was a vocabulary they recognized. In the front row, Julian's parents looked horrified. His father, a man of rigid patrician pride, seemed to shrink into his tuxedo, while his mother's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with dawning terror. Isabella's own father took a half-step forward, his face a thundercloud of confusion and burgeoning rage, his hand clenching and unclenching at his side. Isabella didn't pause. Her voice was relentless, a metronome of damnation. "I promise to honor you in public, to be the perfect doting husband for the photographers, while secretly spending my afternoons in the plush suites of a boutique hotel in Soho. I promise to cherish our future home in Greenwich, to admire the blueprints and debate paint colors with you all, while maintaining a second secret life in a pre-war brownstone on the Upper West Side." At the specific mention of the locations, a low groan escaped Julian's lips. His face went from pale to ashen, the blood draining away so completely that a slick sheen of sweat broke out on his forehead. He knew. In that sickening, heart-stopping moment, he knew that she knew everything. The carefully constructed walls of his double life were being dismantled brick by brick in front of the entire world. And fidelity. Isabella continued, a humorless, razor-thin smile touching her lips. She let the word hang in the air for a moment. "I promise to be faithful to our shared ambition, but not to our bed. I promise to fill my days with an endless stream of lies about board meetings that run late, about urgent business trips to Chicago when I'm really just a few miles away, betraying you in this sacred vow over and over again." She paused, a masterful orator, letting the weight of her words sink in. She looked directly at Julian. His eyes were now wide with a dawning, frantic terror. He was no longer the handsome, charming groom. He looked like a trapped animal, cornered and exposed, his polished facade crumbling into dust to reveal the weak, craven man beneath. And finally she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more menacing, a death sentence delivered with chilling intimacy. "I pledge to you my shared life, my public devotion, and your family's fortune. But my heart, my affection, and my secret gifts, they belong to another." She lifted her eyes from the paper, her gaze sweeping past Julian, past her parents, and locking onto a single figure in the front row. "Isn't that right? Sarah?" The name dropped into the silence like a block of ice into a perfectly still pond, the impact sending shockwaves out in every direction. Every head in the front row, and then in the entire conservatory, swiveled in a single unified motion to look at the woman in the elegant navy blue dress. Sarah Jenkins froze, her face a canvas of pure, unadulterated shock. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving them blotchy and pale. The small, triumphant smile she had worn just minutes before was now a grotesque twist of horror. Her eyes darted from Isabella's calm, accusing gaze to Julian's horrified, collapsing, one desperately seeking some kind of rescue, some denial, some escape. But she found none. In that moment, her carefully constructed composure shattered into a million pieces. She was no longer the confident, ambitious power player from a rival firm. She was a mistress, a homewrecker exposed in the most brutal and humiliating way imaginable. The hedge fund manager and his wife, who were seated next to her, physically leaned away, creating a visible gap, a quarantine zone of shame around her. The collective stare of 300 of the most powerful people in the world was fixed on her, a laser beam of judgment, condemnation, and morbid curiosity. "And since we're being honest now, I believe this belongs to you," Isabella said, her voice ringing with cold finality. She reached into her bodice again, her movements fluid and unhurried, and pulled out the second object she had concealed, the small black velvet jewelry box. With a flick of her thumb, she opened it and held it high for all to see. Nestled on the satin lining, the delicate gold locket, a perfect damning match to the one around Sarah's neck, gleamed under the lights. "A beautiful locket," Isabella said, her voice laced with the sweetest venom, with the initials S.J. engraved on the back. "A token of his undying secret love. He bought it for you just last week, Sarah. He told me he was out searching for the perfect wedding gift for me." That was the final devastating blow. A small strangled gasp, a sound of pure animal anguish, tore from Sarah Jenkins' throat. It was too much. Her face crumpled, her body shaking. With a sob that echoed through the silent room, she scrambled to her feet. She stumbled her high heels, catching on the pristine white aisle runner before she righted herself and fled. She didn't walk. She ran. Blindly, desperately, she charged back down the aisle, her sobs now loud, ugly, and hysterical. The frantic staccato clicking of her heels on the stone floor was the only sound in the world. She pushed past horrified guests, her face buried in her hands, a specter of utter shame and humiliation. As she ran, the operative from Mr. Harrison's team, posing as a guest, lifted his camera. The professional flash fired once a final brutal punctuation mark on her public annihilation, immortalizing her disgrace. A stunned, deafening silence fell in her wake. Every eye now turned back to the altar, to the groom, who had been so thoroughly, so completely, and so publicly destroyed. Julian stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape, his eyes hollow and vacant. He looked at Isabella, at the gleaming locket still in her hand, at the empty space in the front row where his mistress had been sitting moments before. The entire architecture of his life, so carefully and ruthlessly constructed, had been demolished in less than 5 minutes. Isabella calmly, deliberately folded her piece of paper. She let it, along with the velvet jewelry box, drop from her fingers onto the floor at Julian's feet. They landed with a soft, final thud. She looked at him one last time, not with hatred, not with the fire of anger, but with a chilling, dismissive emptiness that was infinitely more cruel. She looked at him as if he were nothing. "The wedding's off," she said, her voice now calm and steady, the voice of a CEO closing a failed deal. She turned to the stunned audience, a regal gesture of dismissal. "But please," she added, a sweep of her hand indicating the lavish reception tents and the army of staff waiting outside. "Enjoy the party. My father and I have paid for it after all." And with that, she turned her back on her groom. She took her father's arm. He looked at her, his initial anger replaced by a look of stunned, profound pride, and squeezed her hand. Ignoring the shell-shocked officiant, her weeping mother, and Julian's utterly broken parents, Isabella de la Cruz, with her head held high, her back straight as steel, and her couture gown trailing behind her like a royal robe, walked back down the aisle. The guests parted before her, their faces a mixture of awe and shock. She wasn't walking away as a jilted bride. She was leaving as a queen who had just defended her throne and reclaimed her kingdom. The aftermath of Isabella's declaration was a chaotic storm of shock, scandal, and schadenfreude. As she swept out of the conservatory, the room erupted into a frenzy of frantic whispers, the sound like 1,000 cicadas buzzing at once. Guests immediately turned to their phones, fingers flying across screens, as the most sensational piece of society gossip in a generation began to spread like wildfire. The hashtag #CruiseCroft wedding hashtag, once a stream of fawning congratulations, instantly became a torrent of real-time, jaw-dropping updates. Julian Croft remained at the altar for a full minute, a statue carved from humiliation. His father, a man whose public face was usually one of stoic control, rushed to his side. his face purple with rage. He grabbed Julian by the arm, hissing words that were too low to be heard by the masses but whose venom was palpable. Julian's mother simply wept into her hands. The Croft family, a dynasty of quiet old money pride, had been publicly disgraced in the most spectacular fashion. They were ushered out a side exit, a retreat of utter shame, avoiding the gauntlet of staring eyes and camera phones. Isabella, meanwhile, did not retreat to the bridal suite to cry. Flanked by her father and a hastily assembled security team, she walked directly to the main reception tent. The band, having been alerted to the change of plans, had switched from classical music to an upbeat jazz number. Waitstaff, impeccably trained for any contingency, began circulating with champagne and canapes as if this were all part of the intended celebration. Isabella took a microphone. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound confidence. "It seems I won't be celebrating a marriage today. Instead," she raised her glass, "I'm celebrating the truth. Please eat, drink, and enjoy the beautiful day. Let's not let a little dishonesty ruin a perfectly good party." Her speech was met with a moment of stunned silence, followed by a roar of applause and supportive cheers. She had not presented herself as a victim, but as a victor. She had taken control of her own narrative, and in doing so had won the respect of a room full of people who admired strength above all else. The story, of course, became legendary. By midnight, the grainy video of Sarah Jenkins fleeing the ceremony, captured by Mr. Harrison's operative, had been leaked to the press and was being played on a loop on news channels and gossip sites. The names Isabella de la Cruz, Julian Croft, and Sarah Jenkins were trending worldwide. The media frenzy was relentless. Tabloids dubbed Isabella the billionaire bride and the vengeance in Vera Wang. For Julian Croft, the fallout was catastrophic. His career in private equity was over before it began. No one would trust their money with a man whose personal judgment was so spectacularly flawed and whose name was synonymous with scandal. He was fired from his firm within 48 hours. The powerful friends he had cultivated abandoned him instantly. He became a social pariah, a ghost in the world he had tried so desperately to conquer. He retreated from public life, his name forever tarnished. Sarah Jenkins faced a similar fate. She was fired from her job, her professional reputation destroyed by the scandal. The digital footprint she had so carefully curated was now overshadowed by the humiliating video of her flight. She deleted her social media accounts and disappeared, her ambition and drive turning to ashes in the fire of public shame. In the weeks that followed, Isabella focused on rebuilding. She threw herself into her work at the foundation, channeling her anger and hurt into productive energy. She launched a new initiative to support women entrepreneurs, a project she funded personally. She sold the blueprints for the Greenwich home she and Julian had planned and donated the proceeds to the new initiative. She never spoke of Julian or the wedding again in public. She let the story speak for itself. She had taken a moment of profound personal betrayal and transformed it into a declaration of independence. She had been born into a gilded cage, but with her own hands she had melted it down and reforged it into a crown. She was no longer just the Cruz heiress. She was Isabella de la Cruz, a woman of strength, resilience, and unapologetic power. The world had expected a fairy tale wedding, but Isabella had given them something far more real and far more inspiring, the story of a woman who refused to be a footnote in her own life, choosing instead to write the entire book herself. Isabella's story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most painful betrayals can lead to our greatest moments of strength. She turned her heartbreak into a public spectacle of empowerment, refusing to be a silent victim. What did you think of her incredible act of vengeance? Let us know in the comments below. The glittering chandeliers of the Grand Oak Ballroom reflected in Victoria Sterling's champagne flute, but the sparkle couldn't reach the icy dread coiling in her stomach. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of her husband Richard's latest triumph, a merger that would solidify his empire. But as Richard took the stage, his hand wasn't reaching for hers. It was entwined with a woman whose smile was as polished as the marble floors, a woman he introduced not as a colleague, not as a friend, but with 3 words that shattered Victoria's world: my new wife. Little did he know while he was rewriting their life story, she was about to erase his name from every asset he owned. Victoria Sterling had long been the epitome of quiet elegance, a woman who moved through the gilded circles of New York high society with an understated grace that many mistook for fragility. She was the perfect wife for a man like Richard Sterling, a real estate magnate whose ambition was as towering as the skyscrapers that bore his name. Theirs was a life curated for magazine spreads, a sprawling penthouse on Park Avenue with panoramic views of Central Park summers in the Hamptons, and a collection of art that could rival a small museum. To the outside world, they were a power couple, a testament to having it all. But Victoria knew the truth. Their life, once a vibrant tapestry of shared dreams and passionate nights, had faded into a carefully orchestrated performance. The laughter no longer reached Richard's eyes, and his touch, when it came, felt more like a formality than an act of affection. She had first noticed the change about a year ago. It was subtle at first. Late nights at the office he claimed were due to a demanding new project, a sudden obsession with his phone that he'd angle away from her, the faint, unfamiliar scent of perfume on his collar that he'd brush off as a chance encounter with an overzealous client. Victoria, ever the pragmatist, had tried to address it. She suggested counseling, a vacation, anything to bridge the chasm that was silently growing between them. Richard had dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand, attributing her worries to pregnancy hormones. Yes, Victoria was pregnant. 7 months along with the child they had both so desperately wanted, a child she had thought would be the glue to mend the cracks in their marriage. Now the gentle kicks in her womb felt less like a promise of new life and more like a countdown to an impending storm. Tonight was the annual Sterling Enterprises Gala, a lavish affair to celebrate the successful merger with a rival firm. It was the culmination of a year of relentless work for Richard, a deal that would cement his legacy. Victoria had spent the afternoon in a flurry of preparations, her personal stylist fussing over the deep sapphire gown that cascaded over her baby bump, a team of hair and makeup artists sculpting her into the perfect image of a billionaire's wife. But beneath the layers of silk and diamonds, a sense of unease gnawed at her. Richard had been unusually distant all week, his conversations clipped and his eyes holding a secret she couldn't decipher. As she stood before the full-length mirror, her hand resting protectively on her stomach, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was adorning herself for a sacrifice. The woman staring back at her was beautiful, poised, and utterly alone. The drive to the Grand Oak Ballroom was silent, the tension in the back of the Rolls-Royce so thick she could have cut it with the diamond-encrusted knife she'd received as a wedding present. Richard was engrossed in his phone, a small, tight smile playing on his lips as he typed. He didn't notice the way her hands trembled in her lap, or the way her gaze lingered on his profile, searching for a flicker of the man she had married. The ballroom was a sea of familiar faces. Business partners, rivals, and the city's elite, all swathed in couture and dripping with jewels. The air buzzed with a mixture of genuine admiration and thinly veiled envy for the man of the hour. As they entered, a wave of photographers descended upon them, their flashes like a barrage of tiny explosions. Richard, ever the showman, pulled her closer, his arm a possessive weight around her shoulders, a smile plastered on his face for the cameras. It was a well-rehearsed pose, one they had perfected over the years. But tonight it felt like a betrayal. Throughout the cocktail hour, Victoria played her part with an Oscar-worthy performance. She smiled, she mingled, she accepted congratulations on Richard's success and well-wishes for their impending arrival. But her eyes kept drifting back to Richard, who was holding court at the center of the room. He was in his element, a king in his castle, and she was just another one of his prized possessions on display. It was during dinner that the first tremor of the earthquake to come made itself felt. Victoria was seated at the head table, a carefully curated collection of the city's most influential figures. The conversation was a predictable blend of market trends and summer travel plans. She was picking at her deconstructed Caesar salad when a woman approached their table. She was stunning in that overtly sensual way that was the antithesis of Victoria's classic beauty. Her dress was a fiery red clinging to a figure that was all curves and confidence. Her dark hair was styled in loose cascading waves, and her eyes, the color of warm whiskey, were fixed on Richard. "Richard, darling," she purred, her voice a low, seductive drawl that seemed to silence the surrounding chatter. Victoria watched as Richard's face, which had been a mask of cool professionalism, broke into a genuine, unguarded smile. It was a smile she hadn't seen directed at her in years. "Isabella," he said, his voice laced with an intimacy that sent a fresh wave of ice through Victoria's veins. He stood, his hand lingering at the small of Isabella's back as he introduced her to the table. "Everyone, this is Isabella Rossi, our new head of international marketing. She was instrumental in the final stages of the merger." Isabella's eyes swept over the table, her gaze briefly flicking to Victoria's baby bump before meeting her eyes. There was a flicker of something in their depths, triumph, pity, or perhaps a mixture of both. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you all," she said, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. Victoria's own smile felt frozen on her face. She extended a hand, her voice a cool, steady tone that betrayed none of the turmoil raging within her. "Welcome to the team, Ms. Rossi." The rest of the dinner passed in a blur. Victoria couldn't taste the seared scallops or the perfectly aged filet mignon. The lively conversation around her faded into a dull roar. The only thing she could focus on was the way Richard's attention kept drifting back to Isabella. The subtle glances, the shared smiles, the easy camaraderie that spoke of a history Victoria was not a part of. She felt a hand on her arm and turned to see her father, a retired judge with a sharp mind and an even sharper intuition, his brow furrowed with concern. "Are you all right, Victoria? You look pale." She forced a reassuring smile. "Just a little tired, Dad. This baby is taking all my energy." But her father's gaze was fixed on Richard, who was now laughing at something Isabella had whispered in his ear. When he looked back at Victoria, his expression was grim. He knew just as she did that this was more than just a passing flirtation. This was a paradigm shift, a tectonic plate moving beneath the foundations of their lives. As the dessert plates were cleared and the waiters began to pour the celebratory champagne, Richard stood, tapping his glass for attention. The room fell silent, all eyes on the man at the podium. Victoria's heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had a premonition, a cold, sickening certainty that what he was about to say would change everything. He began with the usual platitudes, thanking his team, his partners, the board of directors. He spoke of the future of expansion of a new era for Sterling Enterprises. And then he paused, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed not on Victoria, but on Isabella. "This merger is not the only new chapter in my life," he began, his voice ringing with a conviction that made Victoria's blood run cold. He beckoned for Isabella to join him on the stage. She moved with the fluid grace of a predator, her red dress a slash of color against the dark suits and muted tones of the room. Richard took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it as he turned to face the stunned audience. "As many of you know, my personal life has been in a state of transition." He glanced briefly, almost dismissively, in Victoria's direction. "Victoria and I have been separated for some time now." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. It was a lie, a bald-faced, audacious lie. They lived in the same house, slept in the same bed, were expecting a child together. But Richard wasn't finished. He raised Isabella's hand to his lips, his eyes never leaving hers. "And so it is with immense joy that I introduce to you the future of Sterling Enterprises and the future of my life." He paused for dramatic effect, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that carried to every corner of the room. "My new wife, Isabella Sterling." The world tilted on its axis. The chandeliers seemed to sway, the chatter of the room dissolving into a deafening roar in Victoria's ears. She saw the flash of a diamond ring on Isabella's finger, a gaudy, ostentatious thing that was so unlike the classic elegance of the ring Richard had given her. She saw the triumphant smirk on Isabella's face, the smug satisfaction in her eyes, and she saw the cold, unapologetic finality in Richard's. He hadn't just been having an affair. He had been living a double life. He had replaced her not just in his bed, but in his entire world. And he had chosen to announce it in the most public, most humiliating way possible. In that moment, something inside Victoria snapped. The hurt, the betrayal, the humiliation, it all coalesced into a single white-hot point of rage. The fragile, graceful facade she had so carefully maintained for years shattered, and in its place was a woman of steel. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply rose to her feet, her movements slow and deliberate, a queen surveying the ruins of her kingdom. She met Richard's gaze across the crowded room, and for the first time in a long time, she saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. He had mistaken her quietness for weakness, her grace for submission. He had made a fatal miscalculation. As the first shocked whispers began to ripple through the ballroom, Victoria turned and walked away, her head held high. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The war had just been declared, and she was already planning her first move. He had introduced his mistress as his new wife. Tomorrow his pregnant and soon-to-be ex-wife would freeze his assets, and then she would dismantle his empire piece by piece. The walk out of the Grand Oak Ballroom was the longest of Victoria's life. Every step was a battle against the tidal wave of emotions threatening to consume her. The shocked faces of their friends and colleagues blurred into a kaleidoscope of pity and morbid curiosity. She could feel their eyes on her back, their whispers like 1,000 tiny needles pricking at her skin. But she didn't falter. Her spine remained ramrod straight, her chin held at an angle of defiance. She was a sterling, and she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. The moment the heavy oak doors of the ballroom closed behind her, cutting off the cacophony of her public humiliation, her composure fractured. A single ragged sob escaped her lips, a sound of such raw anguish that it seemed to echo in the cavernous, empty hallway. She leaned against the cool marble wall, her hand pressed against her stomach as if to shield her unborn child from the shrapnel of his father's betrayal. Her driver, a kind elderly man named Arthur, who had been with her family for years, rushed to her side, his face etched with concern. "Mrs. Sterling, are you all right?" Victoria couldn't bring herself to speak. She simply nodded, a gesture that was more of a tremor than a confirmation. Arthur, with a discretion born of long years of service to the wealthy and their often dramatic lives, simply opened the door to the waiting Rolls-Royce and helped her inside. The drive back to the Park Avenue penthouse was a blur of city lights and silent tears. The glittering skyline that had once been a symbol of her and Richard's shared ambition now seemed to mock her, a constant reminder of the life that had been so cruelly snatched away. When she arrived, the apartment felt cavernous and cold, a mausoleum of broken promises. The photographs on the walls, a curated collection of their happiest moments, now felt like a cruel joke. There was a photo of them on their wedding day, Richard's eyes alight with what she had thought was love. Another of them in St. Bart's, their skin tanned and their smiles carefree. And the most recent one, a professional shot from a few months ago, her baby bump just beginning to show Richard's hand resting protectively on it. A lie. It was all a lie. With a surge of fury, she ripped the photo from the wall, the sound of shattering glass a satisfying counterpoint to the shattering of her heart. One by one, she tore down the images of their life together until the walls were bare, and the floor was littered with the fragments of their shared past. Exhausted and emotionally drained, she sank onto the plush white sofa, the silence of the apartment pressing in on her. The rage that had sustained her had given way to a profound, bone-deep sorrow. How could she have been so blind? The signs had all been there, the late nights, the secret phone calls, the emotional distance. She had chosen to ignore them, to believe in the fantasy she had so desperately wanted to be real. She thought of the baby, her son, and a fresh wave of grief washed over her. He would be born into a broken home, a pawn in a war he had no part in starting. But as she cradled her belly, a new resolve began to take root in the barren landscape of her heart. She would not let Richard destroy their son's life as he had destroyed hers. She would fight not just for herself, but for her child. She picked up her phone, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through her contacts. There was only one person she could call, one person she knew would understand the intricacies of the world she was about to go to war with. The phone rang twice before a crisp, no-nonsense voice answered. "Victoria." "It's past midnight. Is everything all right?" It was her father, Judge Robert Vance, a man whose reputation for integrity and sharp legal acumen was legendary in New York legal circles. He had retired from the bench 5 years ago, but his mind was as sharp as ever. "Dad," Victoria's voice broke. "I need you." Without hesitation, he replied, "I'm on my way." An hour later, her father was sitting opposite her, a tumbler of whiskey in his hand, his face a grim mask as she recounted the events of the evening. She left nothing out, from the subtle signs of Richard's affair to the public brutal announcement of his new wife. When she had finished, the only sound in the room was the gentle clinking of ice in her father's glass. He took a long, slow sip before speaking, his voice calm and measured. "The man is a fool, a cruel, arrogant fool." He leaned forward, his eyes the same shade of deep blue as hers, locking onto her own. "But he has made a critical error. He has underestimated you. And that, my dear, is where we have the advantage." He set his glass down on the polished mahogany coffee table, the sound a sharp, decisive rap. "First thing in the morning we call my lawyer. Not your and Richard's lawyer, not a family lawyer. My lawyer, a shark. We're going to hit him where it hurts, Victoria. We're going to go after his money." A flicker of the old Victoria, the woman who had once been a sharp, ambitious corporate lawyer herself before giving it up to be Richard's wife, sparked in her eyes. "But how all our assets are in joint accounts in trusts. He has a team of the best financial advisors in the country." Her father smiled, a cold, predatory smile that she had seen him use on the bench to intimidate cocky young lawyers. "He may have a team of advisors, but we have something better. We have the truth, and we have the element of surprise." He stood and began to pace the room, his mind already working, formulating a strategy. "He's arrogant. He believes he's untouchable. He won't be expecting a fight. He'll be expecting you to fall apart, to retreat, to negotiate a quiet, dignified divorce. We will do none of those things." He stopped in front of her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "We will be ruthless. We will be relentless. And we will win." For the first time since she had walked out of that ballroom, Victoria felt a glimmer of hope. She was not alone in this fight. She had her father, a man who had never lost a battle in his life. And she had a new, steely resolve. Richard had started a war. She was going to finish it. The next morning, Victoria woke with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. The grief was still there, a dull ache in her chest, but it was now overlaid with a cold, clear anger. She dressed not in one of her usual flowing feminine dresses, but in a sharply tailored pantsuit, the kind she used to wear when she was a lawyer. It was a suit of armor, a statement of intent. She met her father in his study, a room lined with leather-bound law books and filled with the scent of old paper and wood smoke. Standing beside him was a woman in her late 40s, her hair cut in a severe, no-nonsense bob, her eyes sharp and intelligent. "Victoria, this is Evelyn Reed," her father said, "the best divorce lawyer in New York, and for the next few months your new best friend." Evelyn Reed shook her hand, her grip firm and her gaze direct. "Mrs. Sterling, I've read the prenuptial agreement you sent over last night. It's comprehensive." Victoria nodded. The prenup had been Richard's idea, a standard precaution for a man of his wealth. She had signed it without a second thought, blinded by love and the belief that it would never be anything more than a piece of paper in a file. "It is," Victoria agreed. but it was signed under the assumption of a faithful and honest marriage. Richard has violated both of those conditions. Evelyn's lips curved into a faint smile. Indeed, he has. And his very public, very humiliating declaration of a new marriage, while still legally married to you, and with you carrying his child, is a gift. A very, very expensive gift. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. We need to move quickly before he has a chance to hide his assets. We'll file for an immediate injunction, a temporary restraining order that will freeze all joint accounts, trust, and credit lines. We'll also put a lien on all his properties, both personal and commercial. Victoria's eyes widened. Is that possible? It is when you have a husband who has so flagrantly and publicly committed adultery and emotional distress. Evelyn said, her voice laced with the confidence of a woman who knew she was at the top of her game. We'll argue that he is a flight risk, that he may try to move his assets offshore to protect them from the divorce settlement. Given his impulsive behavior, it's not an unreasonable argument. She slid a document across the table to Victoria. This is the petition. I need you to read it carefully and then sign it. Victoria picked up the pen, her hand steady. She read through the legal jargon, the cold, formal language, a stark contrast to the hot, messy emotions of the past 24 hours. But as she read, she felt a sense of power. She was no longer a victim. She was a woman taking control of her life. She signed her name with a firm, decisive stroke. Good, Evelyn said, taking the document back. I'll have this filed within the hour. By lunchtime, Richard Sterling will find himself a very rich man with no access to his money. A small, grim smile touched Victoria's lips. The war had begun, and she had just fired the first shot. The news of the injunction hit Richard Sterling like a physical blow. He was in a board meeting, basking in the afterglow of his successful merger and his bold public declaration of his new life with Isabella. He was feeling invincible, on top of the world. And then his phone buzzed, a frantic text from his personal banker. All your accounts have been frozen. Call me immediately. Richard excused himself from the meeting, a knot of confusion and irritation tightening in his stomach. He dialed his banker, his voice sharp with impatience. What the hell is going on? I have a multi-million-dollar deal closing this afternoon. The banker's voice was strained, apologetic. I'm sorry, Richard. We received a court order this morning. A temporary restraining order. All your personal and business assets are frozen pending a court hearing. Richard's blood ran cold. On what grounds a petition filed by your wife, Victoria Sterling? The name hung in the air, a testament to his own monumental stupidity. Victoria. He had dismissed her, disregarded her, humiliated her. He had expected her to crumble, to retreat into her grief and accept a quiet, generous settlement. He had not expected this. He had not expected her to fight back. He ended the call, his hands trembling with a rage so intense it was almost blinding. He stormed back into the boardroom, his face a thunderous mask. The meeting is over, he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He turned to his personal assistant. Get Evelyn Reed on the phone. Now. He knew the name. Evelyn Reed was a shark, a pit bull in a designer suit. The fact that Victoria had hired her was a clear declaration of war. He spent the next hour on the phone with his own team of lawyers, their voices a panicked chorus of disbelief and damage control. The injunction was ironclad. Victoria had timed it perfectly, hitting him at his most vulnerable right after his public display of arrogance. The judge, no doubt influenced by Victoria's father's reputation and the sheer audacity of Richard's actions, had granted the order without hesitation. He was, for all intents and purposes, a billionaire with no cash. His credit cards were declined. His lines of credit were suspended. The deal he was supposed to close that afternoon was now in jeopardy. His fury, which had been a simmering volcano, finally erupted. He swept his arm across his mahogany desk, sending a cascade of papers, a laptop, and a half-empty coffee cup crashing to the floor. He let out a roar of pure, unadulterated rage, a sound that echoed through the hushed, terrified halls of Sterling Enterprises. He had built this empire from the ground up. He had clawed his way to the top of a ruthless, unforgiving industry. He would not be brought down by a woman he had so carelessly cast aside. He grabbed his phone and dialed Victoria's number. It went straight to voicemail. He tried again and again, each unanswered call fueling his rage. He left a string of increasingly vitriolic messages, his voice raw with a mixture of threats and disbelief. "How dare you, Victoria? After everything I've given you, you'll regret this. I'll see you in court. I'll take everything. You'll be left with nothing. Do you hear me? Nothing." But his threats felt hollow even to his own ears. He had no power here. She had outmaneuvered him, outsmarted him. She had taken his greatest strength, his wealth, and turned it into his greatest weakness. Meanwhile, Victoria was in Evelyn Reed's office, a calm oasis of muted colors and quiet professionalism in the heart of the city. She had listened with a detached sense of vindication to the increasingly frantic messages from Richard. She felt no fear, only a cold, hard certainty that she had made the right decision. "He's panicking," Evelyn said, a small, satisfied smile on her lips. "And when people panic, they make mistakes." She slid a new set of documents across the table to Victoria. "This is a list of forensic accountants, the best in the business. We need to find out exactly what he's worth where all his money is hidden. Richard is a smart man. He'll have offshore accounts, shell corporations, assets hidden in places we don't even know exist." Victoria nodded her mind, already shifting into the familiar analytical mode of her former legal career. "I can help with that. I may have been out of the game for a while, but I know how he thinks. I know the kinds of risks he's willing to take." She remembered conversations she had overheard, late-night phone calls she had pretended not to listen to, hushed meetings with men whose names she had committed to memory. She had a wealth of information, a roadmap to Richard's hidden empire that she had never realized she possessed. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of her own power, a power that had nothing to do with her husband's name or his money. It was her own intelligence, her own resilience, her own strength. The rest of the day was a whirlwind of meetings and phone calls. Victoria and Evelyn assembled their team, a formidable force of legal and financial experts. They worked with a quiet, focused intensity fueled by a shared sense of purpose and a righteous anger. That evening, as Victoria returned to the empty penthouse, she found a package waiting for her. It was from her father. Inside was a small velvet box. She opened it to find a single, exquisitely crafted gold key. Attached to it was a note written in her father's elegant, familiar script. "For your new home, a new start. You are stronger than you know, Victoria. And you are not alone." The address was for a brownstone in the West Village, a beautiful historic building on a quiet, tree-lined street. A place that was hers and hers alone. She looked around the penthouse at the bare walls and the lingering ghosts of a life that was no longer hers. She felt a pang of sadness, a final fleeting moment of grief for the love she had thought was real. And then she turned and walked away, the gold key clutched in her hand. She was not just freezing his assets. She was freezing him out of her life. She was starting over, and she was ready for whatever came next. The fury of Richard was just beginning, but so was her own quiet, unyielding strength. The first court hearing was a spectacle. The media, having caught wind of the salacious details of the Sterling divorce, had descended upon the courthouse in a frenzy. The story had all the elements of a blockbuster drama: a billionaire tycoon, a scorned pregnant wife, and a beautiful, ambitious mistress. Victoria, flanked by her father and Evelyn Reed, moved through the throng of reporters with a quiet dignity that was in stark contrast to Richard's barely concealed rage. He arrived with Isabella on his arm, a move that was clearly intended to be a show of defiance but which only served to make him look arrogant and foolish in the eyes of the judge. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with animosity. Victoria avoided looking at Richard, focusing instead on the calm, steady presence of her father beside her. She could feel Richard's eyes on her, a burning glare of anger and betrayal. But she refused to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Evelyn Reed was brilliant. She laid out their case with a cool, methodical precision, presenting the evidence of Richard's public humiliation of Victoria, his flagrant adultery, and the potential for him to hide his assets. She painted a picture of a man who was reckless, impulsive, and untrustworthy. Richard's lawyer, a high-priced corporate attorney who was clearly out of his depth in the messy world of divorce court, blustered and objected, but his arguments were weak and unconvincing. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman with a reputation for being tough on arrogant husbands, was clearly not impressed. She upheld the injunction, extending it for another 30 days. She also granted Victoria exclusive use of the Park Avenue penthouse, a move that sent a fresh wave of fury across Richard's face. And in a final crushing blow, she ordered Richard to pay Victoria's legal fees and a substantial monthly sum for living expenses. Richard stormed out of the courtroom, his face a mask of thunderous rage. Isabella, her own face pale and strained, hurried after him. Victoria watched them go, a small grim sense of satisfaction settling in her heart. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. In the weeks that followed, Victoria and her team of forensic accountants began the painstaking process of unraveling Richard's complex financial empire. It was a labyrinth of shell corporations, offshore accounts, and cleverly hidden assets. But Victoria had been a better student of her husband's business dealings than he had ever realized. She remembered names he had mentioned in passing, fragments of conversations she had overheard, details she had filed away in the back of her mind without even realizing it. She worked tirelessly, poring over documents, following money trails, connecting dots that no one else could see. And as she dug deeper, she began to uncover a pattern of deception that went far beyond infidelity. Richard hadn't just been cheating on her. He had been cheating his partners, his investors, and the IRS. He had been skimming profits, laundering money, and engaging in a host of illegal activities that could not only destroy his business, but could also land him in prison. The revelation was a shock, but it also solidified her resolve. This was no longer just about a divorce. It was about justice. It was about exposing Richard for the corrupt, amoral man he truly was. One evening, as she was working late in her new West Village brownstone, a place that was quickly becoming her sanctuary, her private investigator called. He had been looking into Isabella Rossi's background, and he had found something interesting. Isabella Rossi is not her real name, he said, his voice low and conspiratorial. Her name is Isabella Delgado, and she has a long history of attaching herself to wealthy, powerful men and then disappearing with a sizable chunk of their fortunes. He sent Victoria a file, a collection of articles, police reports, and court documents. It was a sordid tale of seduction, betrayal, and financial ruin. Isabella was a professional, a black widow who had left a trail of broken men and empty bank accounts in her wake. Victoria's blood ran cold. Richard hadn't just been having an affair with a beautiful, ambitious woman. He had been ensnared by a predator, a con artist who was likely playing a long game of her own. A new terrifying thought occurred to her. Was Isabella working alone? Or was she part of a larger scheme? Was Richard a victim in all of this as well as a perpetrator? The question hung in the air, a chilling possibility that changed the entire dynamic of the game. Victoria realized that this was no longer a two-player battle. There was a third player, a shadowy figure whose motives and endgame were a complete mystery. She looked at the file on her computer screen, at the smiling, beautiful face of Isabella Delgado, and for the first time she felt a flicker of something akin to pity for her husband. He had been a fool, a cruel, arrogant fool. But he had also been a pawn in a much more dangerous game than he had ever imagined. And Victoria, in her quest for justice, had just stumbled into the middle of it. The stakes had just been raised, and the danger was no longer just financial. It was personal. And it was deadly. The next day, Victoria received a package. There was no return address. Inside, nestled in a bed of tissue paper, was a single perfect white rose, and a note written in elegant looping script. "Be careful, Victoria. You're not the only one who wants to see Richard Sterling fall." The message was clear. She had an anonymous ally, someone who was watching from the shadows, someone who knew more about Richard and Isabella than she did. But who was it? A disgruntled business partner, a former victim of Isabella's, or someone else entirely? The mystery deepened, and the danger intensified. Victoria knew that she was walking a tightrope with Richard's rage on one side and a shadowy, unknown entity on the other. But she also knew that she couldn't back down. She had come too far. She had to see this through, not just for herself and her son, but for all the other people Richard and Isabella had harmed. She placed the white rose in a vase on her desk, a symbol of the strange, dangerous alliance she had unwittingly formed. The game was afoot, and she was ready to play. She was no longer just a scorned wife seeking revenge. She was a woman on a mission, a warrior fighting for truth and justice in a world of lies and deceit. And she would not rest until she had uncovered the whole ugly truth, no matter the cost. The single white rose sat on Victoria's desk, a beautiful but unsettling symbol. Its cryptic message, "Be careful, Victoria, you're not the only one who wants to see Richard Sterling fall," was a constant reminder that she was navigating a battlefield with more players than she could see. This was no longer just a divorce. It was a conspiracy, and she was caught in the middle, uncertain of who was friend or foe. Her days became a disciplined routine of war room strategy sessions with Evelyn Reed and the forensic accountants. The woman who once planned galas now hunted for ghost corporations in offshore tax havens. Immersed in financial statements and legal documents, Victoria felt a dormant part of herself reawaken the sharp, analytical mind of the corporate lawyer she had been before marrying Richard. She was rediscovering her own strength, a power independent of the Sterling name. While Victoria grew stronger, Richard was crumbling. The asset freeze had him in a chokehold, his business bleeding investors, and his reputation in ruins. The strain was also fraying Isabella. Monitored by Victoria's investigator, the triumphant mistress had morphed into a tense, nervous figure, the pressure clearly mounting. They were trapped animals, and Victoria knew trapped animals were dangerous, but also predictable. The breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in the form of a plain manila envelope with no return address. Inside was a single USB drive. No note, no rose, just a small black rectangle that promised answers. Her instincts, which had become her most trusted guide, told her this was a pivotal moment. She inserted the drive into her laptop, her heart pounding. A single password-protected folder appeared. On a hunch, she typed a name, Delgado. It opened. What she found was staggering. The drive contained a meticulously compiled dossier on Isabella Rossi, whose real name was Isabella Delgado. It detailed a sordid history of seducing wealthy, powerful men and then vanishing with their fortunes. But the truth was even more complex. The drive held copies of emails, text messages, and recorded phone calls between Isabella and a male collaborator. They spoke of Richard as the mark and the merger as the payday. Their plan was cold and clinical. Isabella would secure her position as the new Mrs. Sterling, and then together they would bleed Richard's empire dry. The most chilling revelation was that this collaborator wasn't just a partner in crime. He was Isabella's husband. They were a professional team of predators. As Victoria scrolled through the damning evidence, a familiar name in an email made her blood run cold. It was the name of the man who had been Richard's closest friend and business partner for over a decade, a man who had offered Victoria his deepest sympathies on the night of the gala. It was Marcus Thorne. The entire conspiracy snapped into place with sickening clarity. Marcus, eaten away by a secret jealousy of Richard's success, was the mastermind. He had fed Isabella the inside information needed to ensnare Richard. He had orchestrated the entire affair to shatter Richard personally and professionally. The white rose, the anonymous tips, it had all come from Marcus. He had been using Victoria as his own unwitting weapon, expecting her to be a predictable, grief-stricken wife whose legal actions would perfectly serve his own vengeful plot. He had made the same mistake Richard had. He had profoundly underestimated her. Leaning back, her mind reeling, Victoria saw the full chessboard. This was never just about Richard's infidelity. It was a multi-layered betrayal, and she had been cast as a pawn. But pawns, she thought with a surge of cold fury, can become queens. She would not be an instrument of Marcus Thorne's revenge. She would be the agent of his and Isabella's downfall. She picked up the phone, her hand steady and her purpose clear. "Dad," she said, her voice calm and resolute. "I know who our anonymous ally is. He isn't our ally at all, and I know exactly what we need to do." Victoria walked into Evelyn Reed's office the next morning not as a victim but as a strategist. She laid out the evidence from the USB drive detailing the entire sordid plot. Evelyn's professional composure was tinged with awe. "This is criminal," the lawyer stated. "Conspiracy, fraud, extortion. We take this to the district attorney." "We will," Victoria agreed, "but we're going to do it my way." Hey. A plan was already forming in her mind, a trap not just for Isabella, but for the puppet master himself. She would turn their own conspiracy against them. The game had changed, and Victoria was about to make her move. The plan was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, as audacious as it was brilliant. It hinged on exploiting the very greed and arrogance that had driven her enemies. Victoria, guided by Evelyn and her father, was no longer just a participant in this war. She was its architect. The first move was to create an illusion, a ghost asset so tantalizing it would be impossible for Marcus and Isabella to ignore. Through a trusted media contact, a story was carefully leaked. It whispered of a secret offshore holding company in the Bahamas, an untouched reserve of Richard's wealth worth hundreds of millions, which he was now preparing to liquidate in his desperation. The asset was a complete fabrication, a phantom born in the strategy sessions in Evelyn Reed's office, but it was crafted to seem utterly real. As anticipated, the story ignited a firestorm in the financial world, and more importantly, landed squarely in the laps of Marcus Thorne and Isabella Rossi. Victoria's private investigator confirmed their frenzied reaction. They were circling the bait. To force their hand, Evelyn filed a new motion in court. It was a bold legal maneuver seeking to have Richard declared financially incompetent due to his erratic behavior and the undue influence of Isabella. The motion requested a court-appointed trustee to seize control of all sterling assets to protect them. This was a direct threat to Marcus and Isabella's endgame. If a trustee stepped in, their phantom prize in the Bahamas would vanish into a legal quagmire. The clock was ticking. They had to make their move now. The trap was set. The call Victoria had been waiting for came on a stormy Thursday night. It was Richard, his voice stripped of its usual bravado, replaced by a raw, desperate edge. "Victoria, we need to talk," he began, the words strained. "It's about Isabella, about everything." Victoria's heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice was a steady, cool line in the storm. "I'm listening." He stumbled through a panicked story. Isabella had presented him with a lifeline, a way to get his money out and escape. She told him of the Bahamian company, a forgotten asset, and claimed she had a private investor ready to buy it for cash, no questions asked. Richard, desperate to reclaim any semblance of control, had almost agreed. But a sliver of doubt, a flicker of his old business acumen, had stopped him. He finally saw the predatory glint in Isabella's eyes for what it was. "I think she's playing me, Victoria," he whispered, his voice cracking with the admission. "I think she's been playing me all along." This was the critical moment. "She is Richard," Victoria said, her voice softening with an unexpected wave of pity. "And she's not working alone. She laid out the entire conspiracy for him, Isabella's real identity, Marcus Thorne's deep-seated betrayal, the cold, calculated plan to utterly destroy him." A long, choked silence hung on the line, the sound of a man's world completely shattering. "What do I do?" he finally asked, his voice barely audible. "You do exactly what I tell you," she commanded, her tone now firm, authoritative. "You play your part. And for once, Richard, you trust me." The final act was staged at a discreet high-end club in Midtown, a bastion of old money and whispered deals. Richard, wearing a wire provided by the district attorney's office, was to meet Isabella and her investor to sign away the phantom company. Victoria was stationed in a surveillance van a block away, her eyes glued to the monitors that showed the drama unfolding, detectives from the NYPD's white-collar crime unit flanking her. She watched Richard enter his performance as a broken, desperate man, unnervingly convincing. Isabella, a vision in crimson, greeted him with a kiss that was pure venom. And then the investor arrived. It was Marcus Thorne, striding in with the unshakable confidence of a man who believes he has already won. The three of them sat, the air thick with deceit. Victoria listened, her breath held as Richard played his role to perfection, feigning hesitation and doubt, drawing his enemies deeper into the web. Finally, Marcus's patience wore thin. He dropped the pretense, his voice dripping with venomous pride, as he boasted of his master plan of how he had orchestrated Richard's ruin from the start, mocking his friend's blindness and arrogance. Isabella joined in her contempt, palpable as she recounted her methods of manipulation. It was a full, damning confession broadcast directly to the detectives in the van. With the confession recorded, Victoria gave the signal. Just as Marcus slid the final document across the table for Richard's signature, the doors to the private room burst open. NYPD, the detectives announced, their badges held high. Marcus Thorne, Isabella Delgado, you are under arrest. The transformation on their faces was instantaneous and absolute. The smug triumph curdled into sheer primal terror. As they were led away in handcuffs, their expensive clothes suddenly looking like cheap costumes, Marcus's eyes locked onto a security camera. In that moment, he knew. He hadn't been defeated by Richard. He had been comprehensively outplayed and destroyed by the woman he had fatally underestimated. Victoria leaned back in her chair in the van, a long, slow breath of victory escaping her lips. It was over. She had won. Stepping out into the cool city night, she felt a profound sense of release. She had faced the architects of her misery, and using her own intellect and courage, had brought their world crashing down. She was Victoria Vance Sterling, and she was finally indisputably free. In the aftermath of the arrests, the full scope of Marcus Thorne's and Isabella Delgado's deception was laid bare for the world to see. The story dominated the news cycle for weeks, a salacious tale of greed, betrayal, and high society intrigue. The trial was a media circus, with every detail of the conspiracy dissected and analyzed in excruciating detail. Marcus and Isabella, faced with the overwhelming evidence against them, including their own recorded confessions, had no choice but to plead guilty. They were sentenced to lengthy prison terms, their glamorous lives reduced to the stark, sterile reality of a prison cell. For Richard, the reckoning was of a different kind. He had been a victim, but he was not an innocent one. His arrogance, his infidelity, his cruelty towards Victoria had all been the catalyst for his own downfall. He had lost his company, his reputation, and the respect of everyone who had ever mattered to him. The injunction on his assets was eventually lifted, but what remained was a fraction of his former fortune. He was a rich man, but he was no longer a king. He was humbled, broken, a man forced to confront the wreckage of his own making. He and Victoria finalized their divorce quietly, without the drama and acrimony that had defined the beginning of their separation. In the end, there was nothing left to fight over. On the day the divorce was finalized, Richard asked to see her one last time. They met in a small, neutral cafe a world away from the glamorous restaurants and exclusive clubs they had once frequented. He looked older, tired. The arrogance that had once been his defining characteristic was gone, replaced by a quiet, profound sadness. "I'm sorry, Victoria," he said, his voice raw with a sincerity she had never heard from him before. "For everything. For my cruelty. For my foolishness. For not appreciating the incredible woman I had by my side." He looked down at his hands, at the faint tan line where his wedding ring used to be. "You were always too good for me. I see that now." Victoria listened, a strange sense of peace settling over her. The anger, the bitterness, it had all dissipated, leaving behind a clean, quiet space. "I forgive you, Richard," she said, and she meant it. "Not for you, but for me. I can't carry that anger with me into my new life." She stood to leave, her hand resting for a moment on her now prominent baby bump. "I wish you well, Richard. I hope you find some peace." And with that she walked away, leaving him to his coffee and his regrets. It was the final definitive end to a chapter of her life that had been defined by him. A few weeks later, Victoria gave birth to a healthy, beautiful baby boy. She named him Nicholas after her grandfather, a man of quiet strength and unwavering integrity. She held him in her arms, his tiny fingers wrapped around hers, and felt a love so fierce, so profound, it eclipsed everything that had come before. He was her future, her hope, her reason for everything. She raised him in the West Village brownstone, a home filled with love, laughter, and the scent of baking bread, rather than the cold, sterile perfection of the Park Avenue penthouse. Her father was a constant doting presence, a proud grandfather who delighted in spoiling his grandson. Victoria did not return to the world of corporate law. She had found a new calling. She used a portion of her divorce settlement to start a foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing legal and financial assistance to women who were victims of financial abuse and fraud. She became a champion for the voiceless, a warrior for the vulnerable. She used her own experience, her own hard-won wisdom to help other women reclaim their lives, their power, their sense of self. She was no longer Victoria Sterling, the billionaire's wife. She was Victoria Vance, a mother, a philanthropist, a woman who had taken the shattered pieces of her life and rebuilt them into something stronger, more beautiful, and infinitely more meaningful. One sunny afternoon, as she was pushing Nicholas in his stroller through Central Park, she saw a familiar figure in the distance. It was Richard sitting alone on a park bench, throwing breadcrumbs to the pigeons. He looked up and saw her, and for a moment, their eyes met across the green expanse of the park. He gave her a small, sad smile, a silent acknowledgement of all that had been lost and all that had been found. Victoria smiled back, a genuine, radiant smile of a woman who was at peace with her past and excited about her future. And then she turned and continued on her way, pushing her son towards the playground, towards the laughter and the sunshine, towards the beautiful, ordinary, extraordinary life that she had built for herself. The drama was over. The story was hers to write. And it was just beginning. The story of Victoria Sterling is a powerful reminder that the greatest strength is often forged in the deepest betrayal. She transformed from a scorned wife into a master of her own destiny, proving that with intelligence, courage, and a refusal to be a victim, you can not only survive the storm, but also learn to command the winds. Her journey from heartbreak to empowerment is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit.